Sex Positive Talk, where shame ends and nothing is off limits. Brought to you by Advocating for Sex Positive Education and Consent Culture, EmpoweredHearts.com, and GTFORadio.ca. I'm your host, Angel, queer fembi, sexuality educator, and sex coach. Hey everybody, welcome to Sex Talk. My name is Angel. I use they, them, or she pronouns. And this is a special episode because we have a new guest talking about a new topic, and I think you're all going to want to stay tuned. So just remember, this is sponsored by Advocating for Sex Positive Education and Consent Culture, ASPEC, GTFO Radio, and Empowered Hearts, which of course is my consulting company. So Shannon, introduce yourself. Tell us a little about you.
Awesome. Gladly. Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon. I use she, her pronouns. The best way probably to introduce myself would be to tell you that I consider myself a student of the human condition. I have been gathering all kinds of knowledge, all related to kind of putting together pieces of what makes us human. My bachelor degree was in psychology and anthropology, and I was really lucky that concurrently with my degree, I got into yoga, which then got me really interested in the psychosomatics and all of this overlap between the body and the mind, and how I can do a simple few poses and all of a sudden my internal landscape is different. And I'm a bit of a mystic and a scientist put into one body, which is often very confusing. I come from a long line of staunch skeptics and hard scientists. So I do have the kind of mind that wants to understand all the experiences I'm having, but I also have the kind of body that has all these mystical experiences and needs the reasoning behind it. So I had studied yoga for a while. I taught yoga for about 6 years after graduating with my degree. And still something felt a little incomplete because my psychology education gave me view into who we are as people and our minds and how they're shaped. And then anthropology gave me some context for who we are within social connection in large groups. And yoga gave me this background of who we are in relation to our spirituality and a bit of who we are in relation to our bodies. And there was still a bit of a blind spot left there where I felt like all of these pieces were missing like an engine, like some generative force that would make it all actionable. And I was really lucky to come across the body of work called Somatic Experiencing, which in broad strokes is just this approach to trauma resolution that talks about how we hold all of our stories in our bodies, and that ultimately trauma is not really in the experience itself. So it's not in the event that you would describe, but it's actually in the body and how that event left a certain imprint in the body. And so working with trauma, there are many ways of doing that nowadays. And in talk therapy, you would get into the event itself and you would deconstruct it and reconstruct it in many ways. But in somatic experiencing, the story itself isn't as important as the body that you're currently in and how the story is in the body. And then we work on...
so this is kind of like vagal theory.
Yeah, it includes a lot of vagal theory in the approach.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's mostly working with our just fundamental biological drives and understanding them and giving them a venue. Because oftentimes we'll have these experiences that create a charge in our bodies and it's unreleased and it's stuck, and then it continues to inform everything else we do, kind of like a scratch on a record, and then every time you go over that scratch, like it skips. Mm-hmm. So unresolved experiences remain in our bodies, and when our bodies have current experiences that overlap with our past experiences that are unresolved, there's that bit of a skip, there's a bit of a jump, like a bit of a hiccup that happens. And somatic experiencing creates space for that to be smoothed over and worked out in the real time with the real body without getting too caught up in all of the stories.
And that's I love how you were able to bring that curiosity piece that actually started that whole field of research in the first place, right? Like when we look at somatic
Yeah.
theory, they were like, but you're coming from a different angle. Like you're coming from the angle of wanting to understand your own being, like what makes you who you are. And they came from an angle of like, why are these therapies not working for people who've experienced trauma, right? And it all
Yeah.
comes down to that somatic experience, except you took it a little further,
Yes.
right?
A little
So
further. Yeah. So,
explain to us how.
uh, so
Okay,
I
so
think
first you're
that
connecting this to kink experience.
yes.
Yeah. And I
So
want
this
to
is where we're
say,
gonna
like, we
go.
talk ad nauseum on this show about how different types of sexual experiences can be, they can be very embodied or they can be very disembodied, right?
Hmm.
And I know our workshop at Aspect with your brain on sex and kink talks about that altered mind state that happens, and how that becomes so addictive, because, and addictive isn't quite the right word, but we're really drawn to it because it is
Hmm.
just so encompassing and so authentic, right? Like there's an authenticity in that moment that you don't experience in other ways.
I absolutely agree. One of my yoga teachers, she constantly used to say that presence is when the mind and the body are in the same place. And in somatic experiencing, we often say that your presence is your competence. So, in any environment, you are as competent as you are present. So, if parts of you are somewhere else and you're, stuck in the past or the future, you have limited capacity for being here and acting on this moment in time. And I think kink is such an interesting doorway to getting embodied because there are all of these elements of it that so beautifully weave together.
Yeah.
One of them in somatic experiencing is, for example, that, we heal and we grow in connection and through connection. So you get into these, like, even somatic experiencing therapy sessions themselves, which I'm lucky to have experienced. Honestly, you drop into the space where you're so connected and it feels like you're on MDMA. You have this like spacious body and your mind is really free and you barely have weight in this world, but there's this like broadband connection that you develop with this one person and you're fully seen and you're fully supported and you're fully present and aware both of yourself and them, which I think is a fairly rare experience in the world
Yeah.
because we're often on one side or the other. We're either so preoccupied with what this experience means for me and who I am in it and am I performing well and blah, 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 that we're just us and we're not aware of them. Or on the opposite side of the spectrum, we're so preoccupied with how they're receiving this experience and, are they having a good time or what are they thinking about me, that we lose our sense of self. And so in kink, I really appreciate that. I mean, of course, you can do anything and everything by yourself, but a big chunk of it is experienced in community, either with one partner or multiple, or, even if you're watching or somebody else is watching, there's still this anchoring presence that just gives so much more depth and richness to the experience that is rare to find anywhere else.
I've got goosebumps. Yeah, and it's a hard thing to try and explain to somebody who's never had a truly consensual supported kink experience. Because I think a lot of people, they'll be like, yeah, spank me, tie me up, whatever. And they're not in a position where they've developed that trusting foundation, or the
Mhm.
person they're doing things with doesn't understand how to both engage physically with another body and be cognizant of their boundaries, right?
Yeah.
And in that, we talk a lot about how in order to hit that mind space, you have to give yourself to it, right?
Mhm.
You can't force somebody to experience subspace. They have to feel safe enough to drop those
Mhm.
boundaries and let you in. And I
Yeah.
am not a mystical person. So
Mhm.
when I start talking about the flow of energy and dropping your boundaries and letting somebody inside that bubble that we keep to ourselves all the time, like you can take that one to the bank, right? Like that's
Mhm.
um and yeah, that's I had never heard of it explained the way you did when we met. So, like, I was like,
Mhm.
"Oh, I love this. I love that you're bringing all the science theory into it as well as that deeper spiritual connection."
Yeah, and we will get into way more parts of this. I have notes. I'm a note taker, so I have a
Yay!
journey prepared, and I'll just touch briefly on what you said about dropping our boundaries. And later in our conversation, I'll talk about some of the ways that like we can build a bridge from where we are to actually being able to drop our boundaries because some people just can't. They just physically can't. And we need to learn all of these like small steps in between and refine our awareness and presence in ourselves so that we can get to the point where we are, first of all, aware of our boundaries, where we can sense them, we can feel them, we can actually like have a visceral uh, anchor in what we actually need or want, and then to be able to voice it. But it's not just like a one or zero kind of like on off switch to be able to have no boundaries to having boundaries. It's a dial that needs to be refined. And actually, my venture into kink was at the Aspect open house. I have, yeah, you really redirected where my life is going. Um,
I'm honored.
I'm honored. I've always been curious about all of these things, but I was married for a while to a person who wasn't really interested in any of those things. So I didn't really have the freedom to explore. And when I have left my marriage, I started to, I considered dating and all of that, but all of that just seemed so unappealing. And then I saw the Aspect Kink Open House, and I was like, yes, this is the one thing that felt like a wholesome yes in my body, and I needed to go see it. And I remember all the stations that you had, and for the first time in my life, I had received a flogging, and it was from you, Angel. Um, and I was having
My
all of
ego's
these,
getting big.
yeah. No, actually, I was having all of these discoveries. And I think that's one of the most important parts of getting embodied is that I'm even getting like choked up talking about it because I used to consider myself a fairly intelligent person and I would take so much pride in my ability to think about anything and everything and to like, reach all of these broad ranges of philosophical thought. And I'm continuously just so humbled by how much richer a sensory experience can be and how much more it can teach us. And there I was getting flogged in this swingers club space. And I had all of these paradoxical feelings where, yes, there's pain, but there's also this comfort, like a nurturance, like a presence that I was sharing with you. And you were constantly checking in and making sure that everything was going well and, asking me if intensity is to be upped or decreased. And I had never experienced pain within a context that was so safe and deliberate and nurturing. And I had these realizations that, pain gets a bad rep and for a reason.
But
Yeah. And
it gets a bad rep for good reason. I
yeah,
mean, it's a warning sign that we're in danger, right? Like, our body
absolutely.
lets us know, and that's incredible that it can communicate to us like that.
Yeah. And I mean, think about how we experience pain because our brains, like our intelligence, is really just a data bank of everything we've experienced. We can imagine some things, but ultimately our brain is a data bank of the past experiences. And as a little human growing up in the world, the way we experience pain is at best accidental, like if you trip and fall, and at worst, outright traumatizing and vicious and really dehumanizing. So it's very like it's pretty impossible that we would naturally encounter a context of pain where it's safe and pleasurable. And what happens is the more adverse experiences we have, and as I just mentioned, most of the time we experience pain as adverse,
Mhm.
um, our window of tolerance, which is like our capacity for holding human experience, it shrinks, because then you go, okay, well, I was spanked as a child, so this kind of touch means abuse and, disconnect and shame and guilt. And so I'm going to withdraw myself from that kind of touch. Or, this other thing happened and it made me feel that way. So anytime I feel that way, I'm going to minimize the times that I feel that way, because I have all of this meaning attached to what the sensory experience means. And in somatic experiencing, that would be called like coupling dynamics, where a thing is not just a thing, it always comes with the sensory experience and the meaning we attach to it.
The emotions, yeah.
Yeah. And so, as I was getting flogged by you, I was just realizing that this was my first experience of pain as reclamation of my capacity to feel. And you even mentioned that you said you didn't like to refer to it as pain. You said it was stimulation. And it was just this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, pain doesn't actually have to come coupled with a bunch of adverse experiences or meanings. It can just be sensation. Just like I'm capable of feeling cold and hot and have really hot showers and enjoy them, I can have a really spicy experience on my skin and enjoy that as well. And this broad window opened up in my mind where I was like, man, kink has so much capacity for us to regain ourselves, and all these ways where we've shrunk away from certain kind of touch or certain kind of sensory or emotional experience. We can learn to slowly start expanding that by creating the conditions and the context that allow for it to be safe and, more importantly, chosen, like chosen deliberately and negotiated. And it can just restore such a part of us that's gone missing. And I think that's incredibly beautiful.
Oh, I am one, I really want to thank you for the vulnerability you're showing right now. For people that are listening and watching and that kind of thing. But like for my own self too, like to hear how that can impact somebody is so profound. Like, and I know how it impacts me when I get to experience that as a top or a bottom, where things just flow and it's so consensual and authentic, and you just get to be in that moment and it's magic. Like it's really
Mhm.
magic. But to know that I was able to provide that for somebody is, it just makes my heart feel so good to know.
Mhm.
And it's one of those events that we get a lot of pushback from with stakeholders in the community and, with our charity license and stuff like that, right? Where we can't get a charity license because we host events like Taste of Kink. Because people
Wow.
don't understand what the intent is. And there's so much to it, right? Like when you invite people in to a space where consent isn't just talked about, but it's actually embodied in all of the practices around it, and you allow people to explore something safely, one, we're really raising the bar as to what they're
Mhm.
going to expect in the future, and it changes the way you view your own bodily autonomy coming into
Mhm.
an event like that. So even people are like, "You know what? None of these activities are for me." That's okay. Those
Mhm.
sensations don't work for you, not a problem. But the next time you're getting intimate with someone, even if it's a massage, you're going to feel when somebody's not respecting your boundaries. It just heightens that
Mhm.
awareness. And for people giving sensation, even if it's a massage, it heightens your awareness of how to check in and to be aware of those
Mhm.
boundaries, because it's all part of that experience. And then on top of that, people are doing this stuff anyways, and they're doing it unsafely,
Yeah.
right? So just by experiencing it that way, you're learning the safety parameters and how to mitigate the risks. Because when we're vulnerable, there's risks. When we're experiencing sensation, and I mean, you're coming from the other end of that, like there's risks. We can cause people to shrink in and hold themselves tighter if we're not respecting them as a whole person in that experience, and ourselves,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
We have to respect ourselves as a whole person in that experience. And I think it's a vital part of reducing the amount of violence we see in relationships.
Oh,
You know?
absolutely. And I think this pushback that you receive, it just really shows how threatening we see desire to be in the society. And I grew up in Uzbekistan, so half of my family are Muslims, and the other half of my family are Russian Orthodox. I was lucky enough to have both of my parents. I know. I was lucky enough to have both of my parents be kind of pulled away from religion a bit. So my nuclear family wasn't super religiously charged, but it was everything around me that still was really, yeah, restrained by religion. And it took me a very long time to recognize that, sexuality and sensuality is okay. And I understand why in the world we might find it as threatening, because I mean, if you think about sexual assaults, like we think they're motivated by desire, and they're not. They're motivated by craving for power. It's not about desire or sexuality or sensuality, but we conflate the two unnecessarily. And all of the boundaries put on women and how we should look and dress and behave. And it's also sold to us as concern for our safety, like, and just the weight of reproductive responsibility that we bear. But it's also not about that. None of it is about that. We just inherently view pleasure and desire to be threatening in all these ways that are just not true. And the ways in which it is threatening is purely a response to how restrained it is, rather than the actual pleasure or desire.
Yeah. It's almost like oppression created an impression.
How shocking! Who would have known?
Right.
And I think it's really cool too that you mentioned in aspect spaces how consent is not just talked about but embodied and practiced. And I really, really, truly felt that. And when I was doing my degree in university, I chose to do an independent studies project with my anthropology professor, where I was reading the Yoga Sutras. They're kind of like foundational little principles of your yoga practice. And my job in this project was to figure out a way how I can create a yoga practice, like a class that I would teach physically in a space to moving bodies, while weaving in the sutra without them knowing. Like, how can I hold this practice for you where you're just moving your body? Meanwhile, I am infusing it with like 126 aphorisms that are to restructure you as a person in all these small ways. So I really appreciate the intention of kind of, soaking your interaction with the philosophy of it, so that it doesn't even have to be explicit, but your body will forever know that integrity, and it becomes the new benchmark for all interactions going forward. And you did give that to me, by the way. You managed in just like 5 minutes of flogging me. You gave me a whole new framework from which to approach relationships.
So, hey, folks, check out www.empowered-hearts.com, and you too can book this kind of an experience in a one-on-one environment without risking the scariness of going to a bigger event. But
Yeah.
yeah, just one of the many services I'm happy to provide. For me, like, I think that kink drew me because of all the trauma I had experienced. Because I've been involved in this lifestyle since I was too young to really know it was a lifestyle. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And I had no idea that other people didn't incorporate that kind of intense sensation into their intimate lives. Because without it, I find it hard to be present. I need that intense sensation and the safety net underneath it, like to know that it's intentional, but positive intentional rather
Mhm.
than, to be able to feel that pleasure and intimacy.
I think it's so awesome that you mentioned that. And we're so in sync because without even trying to, we're just like spot on my notes too.
No way.
Yeah, like
Hey.
literally, because the next thing I was going to talk about is trauma sensitivity and how all of these like psychosomatics can really inform and enrich our kink lives. I am by no means qualified to be talking about trauma in depth, but it does need to be mentioned. So, in somatic experiencing, we often talk about like cycles of threat and resolution. If your nervous system got to choose how it experiences threat, it would be something like this. So threat happens, say it's a lion approaching you, and then you react in some way, like your nervous system kicks on some kind of a response, and either to like flee or to fight or to freeze and hide or whatever. And then that nervous system response is successful, the threat disappears, and it's done. Or the threat doesn't disappear and you get eaten and you die, and that's just it. But if the threat disappears, you don't spend a lifetime being traumatized. An antelope that got chased by lion isn't going to be, like after it gets away and gets back to its flock, it's just going to shake off and go back to drinking water. It's not going to go through like decades of therapy and, talk about how bad that was. And that's because the cycle has been completed. There was a threat, there was a nervous system response, and the threat was avoided, and here we are, and it's done. What makes trauma so much more complex for humans, there are several things that go into it, but one of them is we don't clearly have predator-prey dynamics. So in every situation, it's very hard for us to discern whether we're a predator or prey, and therefore to activate the right response to either, aggress or to run away or to hide or whatever. Moreover, a lot of our interactions are so detailed. Like there's all of this elusiveness in them where it's not black and white. You might feel threatened by somebody's look, like the way they look at you, you might be threatened. And then this rational part of you kicks in and goes, well, I'm safe. Like they're way over there. And there's, like all these other people in between us. I can't be seeing this as threatening. And we kind of do all of this constant negotiation of threat and how we respond to it. And is it really a threat? And am I overthinking this? Or maybe this is my bullshit that I should hold back and not project onto them. And so we get into all of this like viscosity of human experience and how vague it is. And in that, we actually lose our capacity for our nervous system to respond clearly and in the appropriate manner and to complete the threat and resolution cycle. So what happens in that scenario is we go through life kind of collecting a bunch of these incomplete patterns that are then stuck in our bodies. And for better or for worse, there's this impetus in the body to recreate the experience to then complete it. I want to say
And
that
I have a graphic that goes with exactly what you're saying from
yeah.
a psychology and counseling sort of thing here. So I'm going to just share my screen for a second. So when you look at this, it's showing the cycle. You can actually see the arrows and they come back down. And if you experience trauma over and over again, what happens is you only get to the top and then you just cycle in whatever, your experience is up here.
I only see it says error with screen share annotation, so I don't see the graphic, but I am following your words.
What? I'm hoping that other people can see it. Let me try again.
Yeah, it just says disabled annotation.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and we can include it in the notes as well. But yes, I do know what you're talking about. And so it's this, you get stuck in this process. And I am going to say this again, and I'm going to say it slowly.
Stuck in the process.
Yeah.
All the time. Yeah.
It's very important, though, that we have this impetus to recreate the experience to then resolve it. But the problem is it's a largely subconscious process. So when we recreate the experience, we haven't actually come to it with stronger boundaries or more skillful communication or even the awareness that this was an adverse experience the first time around. All we know is that there's this desire to recreate it, and here we are again. And there's this high potential for re-traumatization because we end up having the same experience that also ends up being incomplete. And you mentioned how earlier some experiences can be addictive, and this incomplete cycle of trauma can be addictive because they're like the impetus to recreate it, to resolve it, doesn't go away until it's resolved. And then we do it time and time again, and it's still unresolved. And all of a sudden, you're in this, Groundhog Day situation where you're just reliving it, and you get into this space where, the first time it may have been an adverse experience, but every time since then, it's become familiar, and therefore it starts to feel safe. And therefore, it starts to feel something like it's something desirable. And worse yet, it starts becoming a part of our identity.
Which
Now
is
I'm
how
I'm
we
the
end up
person who
attracted
likes
to people that aren't healthy for us. Yeah.
exactly. And so then you kind of like you go from this one adverse experience to then cementing that as part of who you are, and then letting that be the root from which you interact with everything and everybody else. And so there is a high potential for that in kink. And that's why it's awesome that we're having this conversation, because it needs to be called out and this awareness needs to be brought to us, because we're not doing ourselves the right service in that scenario. Excuse me. We're
Yeah.
just replaying what's already been done. And also a
Like,
lot of the conversation, sorry, go on.
we're doing the right action, but we don't have the right foundations. So the intent is skewed,
Yeah.
right?
And
Like rather than doing the growth, we're just stuck in this cycle that's actually
exactly.
breaking down our sense of self, and we think it's not.
Yes. And
Mhm.
we kind of don't have a clear sense of what the goal is in that interaction. We think the goal is to just receive this sensory experience again, and we forget that the goal is to resolve it. Um,
Or
and
in
that's where
kink
we have
terms,
to
we think the goal is to be able to tolerate the sensation that's being given to us
yes.
in order to please someone else, and we're forgetting the part where we can embody our own oomph, our own je sais quoi, right? Like we can
Uh,
embody
yeah.
that in the moment, but that
Yes.
person has to respect who we are.
And this reminds me too, one woman that I've learned so much from is Kimberly Ann Johnson, and she is a somatic education or somatic experiencing educated person. And at some point, she was talking in one of her workshops about Wim Hof and how, you know, his whole body of knowledge is about like cold water and essentially choosing an adverse experience for your nervous system so you can build capacity for adverse experiences in general. Because then you get to choose the safe context for it. You get to work up that capacity one bit at a time so that when you are out in the world and you get into a car accident, that doesn't crumble you and you remain chill and present and grounded. And in one of her talks, she was saying how she started taking these ice baths, and it got to like she was able to stay in them for longer and longer and longer and longer, and it became this like process of kind of earning the next benchmark of how long she stayed in the cold. And then she was like, and this one moment, I just woke up and I was like, why is it so comfortable for me to be cold all the time? And she had to learn how to be warm. And that sends like shivers down my whole body, because what you were just saying, how like, you know, we become preoccupied with just making sure that we can continue to have this adverse experience and actually handling it better and better and better. At some point, we got to learn how to be warm and how to actually be on the pleasurable side of it instead of on the tolerating side of it.
And setting goals for ourselves that aren't part of our own growth, right? Like being able to
Yeah.
take more sensation is often a sign that you've just developed that real trusting, intimate connection with your partner. But when that becomes your goal instead of just having the experience, you know what I mean? Like this is
Mhm.
it's all about the journey when we're talking about the spirituality connection that you can have to kink. Is it's all about the journey. It's not, if that's your benchmark, and I know I have fallen afoul of it, so like for anybody listening, like don't feel like you're a terrible human being if you've ever gone like, how come I can't take as much today? Because that's, you know, the community loves their pain sluts, and there's a hierarchy that's implied in that, right? So it's really easy to fall prey to it. And I had to, and I continue to have to really work at reminding myself that just being present and being okay with what my body's doing is important. And it's
Mhm.
so much easier to say than do, right? Like that has, you
Absolutely.
have to come to it with that intention throughout the whole thing.
Yep. And a lot of how I'm approaching this conversation is through the trauma work lens and like therapeutic lens. But I also want to add the disclaimer that I'm not suggesting that, you know, you just grab a stranger from Fetlife and use them to resolve
Please
your
don't.
deepest, darkest traumas. Not at all what I'm saying. This is meant to be for professionals who can work and hold space for that kind of thing with you. But what I am saying is that being aware of our own histories and how they live in our bodies can help you seek out experiences that are nourishing and regenerative and healing in small steps for you as a person, instead of just being, you know, a replay of what you've already seen so many times before.
So if there's somebody who's listening and hasn't been to something that's guided and consensual or doesn't have access to like taste a kink, I've been to other people's, which is where we got the idea, but theirs aren't mired in that consent and the embodiment of looking at the other person as something so fragile and yet resilient that you just want to help it grow. You know what I mean? Like that's how we look at the people coming in, whether they're coming in to learn how to give or receive the sensation, doesn't matter. Right? Like we have to look at them as if they're so precious that it's our job to make sure we do nothing to stop their growth. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just, oh, you know, we're gonna respect your boundaries, but like we're gonna show you how to have boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to give you space to learn your boundaries in that moment because we don't
Mm-hmm.
have those opportunities. So like when you're talking to somebody who doesn't have access to that, what would you recommend people do to get in touch with that sense of self that's often not part of our day-to-day anymore? And so folks listening, like stay tuned. There's going to be another piece to this discussion because it's just simply not done.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So to everybody listening, tune in again. This is Sex Talk.